Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Romin.
And I'm Michael.
Despite record tax revenues, Britain's public services are struggling. So what's gone wrong? To answer that question, our guest today is Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and author of Follow the Money.
We explore the structural issues behind Britain's stagnation, how the UK can revive growth, and which taxes might rise in the upcoming budget. So we're delighted to be joined by Paul Johnson today, who's the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul was previously Director of Public Spending at the Treasury and Chief Economist at the Department for Education. Last year, he hit the Sunday Times bestseller list with the fantastic book Follow the Money, explaining how the British state manages to spend £1 trillion every year. So thanks so much for joining us, Paul. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So we're recording this conversation at the start of October, and at the end of this month, the Chancellor will deliver the autumn budget. Now, clearly our listeners are maybe more engaged in their finances and investments than most. Paul, I've got to be honest, they're nerds like we are.
Excellent.
But it's fair to say I've seen so much concern about what might be coming. Do you think people are right to be worried about what might be in the budget?
Well, I'm certainly intrigued. I don't think I've been this intrigued by a budget for quite a long time, because I think it will set the agenda really for the whole of this government. In terms of worried, I guess there's two scopes for worry. One is on the spending side. If the Chancellor doesn't raise much in the way of taxes and the public finances look like we expect them to, then we might see some pretty squeezed spending on public services and maybe on benefits. But I suspect you're talking about people being worried on the tax side, what's going to happen to taxes. And I'm sort of worried there because I suspect that Rachel Reeves is going to want to raise a chunk of money, and yet she has ruled out all of the obvious ways of doing so, which leaves her with some quite difficult and complicated and risky options around things like pensions taxation and capital gains tax and inheritance tax and all of these other sorts of things, because she's ruled out 3/4 of tax revenues straight away by saying no income tax rates, no national insurance, no VAT, no corporation tax. There are a bunch of things that she could do, but she needs to be very careful because you do these too quickly and you could make a mess.
So let me just ask a quick question about the £22 billion black hole, because I saw the IFS article that you wrote about it not being much of a surprise. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, well, I think, it's political theatre, really, isn't it? Saying, we've discovered this 22 billion black hole. I think it's really important to be clear that there are a series of different black holes knocking around to be clear which one's which. There is the important one, which is over the next 4 or 5 years, without increasing taxes, spending is going to be cut. And there's a black hole in that sense because of the state of the public finances. The one that Rachel Reeves is referring to, claiming to be surprised that there's these £22 billion of unfunded spending this year, is in one sense, these numbers, she's right, weren't in the figures, but she knew that we were going to have to spend something in the order of 10 billion on public sector pay increases. So that was a known risk, and it was known it would be of that kind of scale. And the next biggest bit is the cost of asylum. Well, we knew that was going to be £6 or £7 billion. The oddity is the last government didn't have that in the Home Office budget. The expectation had been that it would be paid out of the Treasury reserve. What we don't understand, and what this government frankly has not been transparent about, is what has happened to that reserve if it's not going to be used for asylum. But I think the big picture point is everybody knew pre-budget that we had a big problem with tax and spend, pre-election I mean. We had a big problem with tax and spend, and that if you wanted to avoid spending cuts over the next parliament, you were going to have to increase taxes. And we banged on and on and on about this for the election, and neither party was willing to grapple with it until post-election.
I take it you're not a fan of being ignored by politicians in elections.
Well, it was, I think we clearly annoyed them.
That's your job, isn't it, though, to hold their feet to the fire with a spreadsheet of fire?
There's a great interview with Keir Starmer early on in the election campaign and on the Today programme where I assume probably Nick Robinson was saying, but Paul Johnson has said that in order to avoid spending cuts, you're going to have to do tax rises, and his answer was something like along the lines, "I'll have the greatest respect for Paul Johnson, but we're going to do it all through growth." So there just was a refusal to accept the sort of the obvious arithmetic.
So you mentioned there that the government's kind of tied its own hands by saying it won't raise income tax or national insurance or I believe corporation tax as well, all these big taxes which account for a huge amount of the tax take. And they've also kind of tied their hands with their fiscal rules on the other hand, right? While trying to get debt down in 5 years. How much of this hole could we get out of by just tweaking the rules and hoping markets don't notice?
Well, there's two fiscal rules. One of them is very silly, which is that debt should be falling between the fourth and fifth year of the forecast period. That's in principle exactly the same as Jeremy Hunt's rule, and I'll come back to that in a minute because that is tweakable. And there is a second rule which is actually tighter than the rules that the Conservatives were committed to, which is that in any year we'll only borrow in order to invest. In other words, tax revenues have to cover current spending. Now, the more, certainly at the last budget, the more constraining of those was that debt needs to be falling in the final year of the forecast. Now, oddly enough, there are lots of different possible definitions of debt, and there are changes to the definition which could help a bit. So, for example, by not taking account of the impact of, or taking account differently of the impact of Bank of England action on quantitative tightening. I won't go into the details there, but you could move from public sector net debt, excluding Bank of England, to plain vanilla public sector net debt, and that would help a little bit. And I don't think the markets would squeal at that. Then there are other bigger changes that you could make. You could change to a measure called public sector net financial liabilities, known as PSNUFFLE in the Treasury, which is a great name. Which would give you a lot more headroom for various technical reasons. I'd be quite worried about moving to something like that, because if markets thought you were going to use all of that headroom, that might look like you were really willing to go on a bit of a spending spree, irrespective of its impact on actual headline debt. If you were to make a move on, for example, on those things, gives you more space for investment spending. But because this other rule that you should only be borrowing in any year in order to invest, that would still bind. It wouldn't give you a lot more space for day-to-day spending.
You mentioned the Treasury there, and it seems to me that they get a lot of stick in the media and just on the streets, where people thinking they're kind of the bad guy, just trying to balance the books and saying no to everything. Is that an unfair characterization of what the Treasury does? Because I know you work there, right? So you must have an insight into how they actually do business.
I think, well, it's fair and it's fair and it's not fair. It's fair in the sense that the Treasury does do that, but it's unfair in the sense that someone's got to do that. I mean, we saw what happened when the Treasury got sort of pushed around by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, you do have to have some kind of fiscal discipline. And in the end, it's us, the voters and the politicians who, for example, if we want more spending, aren't that willing to be honest about what that might mean for taxes, because you can't just borrow additional amounts forever. And we're really seeing the impact of that now, because one of the reasons we're in this extraordinary position where taxes are actually pretty high at the moment, but public services appear to be crumbling, is that we're spending such a huge amount on debt interest. And that's because we borrowed so much over the last couple of decades. So we've got an awful lot of debt and quite high interest rates, and that's causing us quite a lot of trouble at the moment. So the Treasury has lots of problems, and it can be a bit inclined to be a bit short-termist, but you have to have someone sitting at the centre of government holding the ring.
Now, about half of the debt which is outstanding is inflation-linked, and I think that's hurting a lot at the moment after the inflation spike. So do you think part of the blame is about the structure of the debt that we've got, as well as about debt limits?
Well, a big part of the problem right now is that a lot of it's held directly by the Bank of England, and we're paying effectively Bank of England base rate on the debts, and that's obviously gone up very fast. Now, inflation right now isn't too bad, so the inflationary impact isn't so bad, but the Bank of England base rate impact is pretty bad. I think actually government holding or government selling inflation-linked debt is a good thing, because that gives the private sector the capacity really to hedge against inflation in a way that's very hard without that sort of inflation-linked stuff. And of course, government got, in one sense, an amazingly good deal on this through the 2010s when real interest rates were very negative. And there are swings and roundabouts on that. And we've been hit by the increases in inflation and the increases in interest rates in the last couple of years.
So you mentioned there that we actually have quite high taxes now, at least compared to our post-war history, and debt is around 100% of GDP. And yet people feel that our public services are declining. How did we end up in what seems like a mess, right? I know this is the topic of your book, so you've done a great job of explaining it. Can you summarize it? Like, how has this happened?
Well, there's two. There's a short-term story and there's a long-term story here. I mean, the short-term is that essentially the increase in taxes was essentially all happened in the last 5 years. And that reflects partly the effect of COVID and slow growth, partly what we've just been talking about, very, very high spending on debt interest payments, which is has to be paid for, and a growth in spending on health and to some extent disability benefits. So you put all that together, that's increased spending, and that's required an increase in tax. I mean, what's more remarkable in a way is that taxes were really quite steady for the 60 years before that, despite the growth in the welfare state, more spending on health, more spending on pensions, more spending on benefits. And essentially we achieved that in partly by very, very dramatically cutting defence spending, so a very big peace dividend over that period, partly through the 70s and 80s of getting out of nationalised industries, stock building houses and that sort of thing, and then through the 2010s, really sharp austerity on public spending. So all of that was just about enough to keep things steady. At some point, that was always going to end. The peace dividend has gone. There's no more nationalised industries to sell. We can't. It's hard to know what else you'd stop the state doing. And with an ageing population, with more and more spending on health, which will carry on rising, and at this moment, this problem with debt and debt interest payments, we hit that sort of moment of truth, as it were, over the last 5 years or so. So my guess is that tax burden, which has gone up by about 3% of national income, is not going to go back down in my lifetime. That would be my guess. It's worth saying in terms of that tax burden, very important to be clear that this is not something that is resulting in higher levels of tax, or at least direct tax, on people on average earnings. This has been remarkably concentrated on high earners and on companies in terms of the increases in tax we've seen over the last decade.
I think I read in your book that the top 1% of earners account for around, 30% of all income tax? Is that right? And is that a problem?
That's right, yeah. Well, in some ways, it's great if someone else is paying the tax. And it partly, of course, reflects the fact that the top 1% have lots of money. And, it's important to be clear what we're talking about here. I can't remember the exact numbers now, but to be in the top 1%, you need a pre-tax income of something in the order of 170,000, something like that. But to be in the top 0.1%, you need a pre-tax income of something like 800,000. So just think about that. To get 99% of the way up the distribution, you go up by 170,000 or so. To get the next 0.9% of the way up, you need another 700,000. So it's incredibly unequal towards the top of the distribution. And the very, very rich obviously pay a very large amount of tax. But actually, if you look over the last 10, 15 years, the reason that the share of income tax by that top group has gone up is not because they've got richer. It's because the tax system has become more progressive. There's many, many more people, 1 million people now, I think, paying the additional 45p rate of tax. We've really squeezed down on pension tax reliefs. Actually, the last government squeezed down quite a lot on a lot of avoidance schemes. And whilst over the period from, say, 1979 to 2008, the top 1% paid more and more because the top 1% got richer and richer. In the period since 2008, they've paid more and more, despite, if anything, getting a little bit less rich relative to the rest of us, certainly not more rich, but because the tax system has squeezed them harder.
So interesting, isn't it? Because that's kind of flown under the radar. Like if you ask the man on the street, did the Conservative government, up taxes on the rich and keep them flat on the average person? People would say, no, it's hit us all.
Of course, neither side want to say that. I mean, the Tories don't want to say, under that Tory government, we really hit the rich. And Labour certainly don't want to say, those horrid Tories hit the rich. So no one wants to say it, but it's true, nevertheless.
Is there, do you think, a generational unevenness in terms of who's taking the burden with this kind of low productivity period, and also in terms of unemployment. So if you look at youth unemployment, it's very different from people who are older. It's very high relative to people who are, say, in their 30s, 40s.
There's definitely a big generational problem. The real problem we've had over the last 15 years is very little, if any, increase in wages. So average wages have barely grown since 2007. So that's a very, very long period. We haven't really seen a period since Napoleon was trying to invade, really. I mean, it's historically unprecedented as far as we can tell. I mean, to the extent that data from the 19th century is at all reliable. But it's absolutely astonishing, actually, average wages haven't grown over such a long period. And the consequence of that, of course, is that working age people have done very poorly, and particularly younger people. But the big change has become the importance, because earnings have flatlined, wealth has become more important. And the generation who were homeowners, particularly the generation with big mortgages back in 2008, have done incredibly well on average. The generation of people retired now who were lucky enough to have occupational pensions and so on, done very well on average. And so we've had a real shift in economic power, as it were, from, to some extent, the working age to the over 60s, shall we say. I mean, these are very broad generalizations. Of course, there are some very, very rich people of working age and very, very poor people of pension age. But if you look in broad generalizations, we've had a shift to wealth becoming more important and being held, obviously, by the older generation. And that, of course, then has impacts through the generations, because part of the younger generation will inherit plenty and part won't. And it's never been more important, at least not in the last 100 years. It's more important to choose your parents wisely. That became less important through the 20th century, but it's become more important now.
Well, I graduated in 2008, and the sort of downturn in, I guess, productivity and wage growth seems to have correlated with the financial crisis around 2008.
Yes.
And I didn't choose my parents. So I can feel this urge amongst the young generation that, can't we get a bit more tax revenue out of the sort of retirees, the boomers, and ease it up a bit for us?
Absolutely, and there are ways that you could do that. Whether they are politically palatable is another question. For example, we have a council tax system which is regressive and based on very out of date values. But if you simply made the council tax system proportional to the value of property, obviously older people tend to have more expensive properties; they would pay more. We have a capital gains tax system which has preferential treatment to some kinds of capital gains. Not all, to be fair, paid by older people, often people in their 40s. Inheritance tax in the end of course is paid by the next generation, but there are straightforward ways of avoiding inheritance tax at the moment. But the most lucrative thing you might do, which I'm sure we won't do, is to put national insurance contributions on unearned income, on, in particular, pensions in payment. Because obviously I pay national insurance contributions on my earnings. Actually, if my employer puts money into my pension, there's no national insurance on those contributions. There's none paid when I retire. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if you really wanted to get money out of older generations, then those are the sorts of things that you could be thinking about.
So you mentioned the tax system there, and it seems to me that we do have a kind of complicated tax system that I guess has grown up organically over time. You've mentioned lots of different taxes there, but even things like income tax, the way it interacts with thresholds and the clawback of the personal allowance, you get this 60% tax trap at £100,000 of earnings, things like that. And especially when child benefit gets involved and withdrawn.
Yeah.
Is this a big impediment to growth? Is this one of the reasons our economy has struggled to grow?
It's a good question. I don't honestly think we know the answer to that. I mean, it's clearly ludicrous, the system that we have. If your earnings just tip over the £50,000 mark, the high rate threshold, you lose the married couples allowance or whatever that's now called. So you can become worse off by earning an extra pound there. As you say, you can have very high marginal tax rates when child benefit is withdrawn. Now over, is it £60,000 or £70,000 recently changed? You've got the 60% income tax rate between 100 and 125,000. So big incentive not to be there. But even bigger incentive, given that you can get childcare paid for as long as your earnings are below 100,000, there will be some people who will need to move from 99,000 to 130,000 to make it worth their while earning anything more at all. So this will almost certainly impact on people's behaviour to some extent. Whether that's a serious impediment to growth, it's very hard to measure.
I mean, I don't want to make this podcast all about me, but I've got 2 children of nursery age and know the pain of having to sacrifice loads into your pension just to get below these thresholds or work less hours, right?
Yeah, and people respond to these. People respond to these incentives. I mean, you're giving something away about your income there, but no, it's a serious. People who understand these things, but certainly respond to those incentives. I also worry that people who don't understand them just get screwed, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you've talked about radical reform of tax, and yet no politician's been brave enough to really do it. Do you think they'll ever be in a position where they can completely start as if it was from a clean sheet of paper?
Oh, you're never going to be able to do that. I mean, I think what you need is a long-term plan to improve what we've got. You can't start. You can't start from year zero. And one of the problems is we've never had. I mean, literally, we have never had government produce a strategy for the tax system. It's unique among all elements of government policy in that sense. And we get year on year something as almost from scratch in every budget. But yes, we absolutely need to have a plan for how we're going to reform income tax. What are we going to do with capital gains tax? What's the role of inheritance tax? How are we going to move corporation tax on? What is the future for business rates? When are we finally going to sort out council tax? And so on and so on and so on. So you need to start from where you are. And for every one of those, you can find ways to improve them. And you need to think about it as a system as well. But that's just not the way that policy has been made ever, essentially.
One of the things you talked about in the book, which seemed to make a lot of sense, was saying that national health spending would go up by a certain percentage every year, and that would be locked in and not debatable. Do you think that's one way to plan it?
Well, certainly, I mean, the National Health Service is a sort of, a great example of something that's been appallingly badly managed over time. I mean, you have periods of feast and periods of famine, and then every year they're given a budget, and then every year it's topped up, and they have to pretend they're managing within the initial budget, and they don't quite know what the level of the top up is going to be. Then they have to spend that, and it's just not a sensible way of running anything. And of course, the point about National Health Service is it is so expensive. It's by far and away the biggest amount of spending on any public service. Is now knocking on for 200 billion a year. It's about 40% of public service spending. Getting that spending right is just terribly important. And productivity in the health service has collapsed in the last 5 years for reasons. We've got lots of ideas about why that might be, but we don't really understand why that's happened. So, there are lots of things that really matter about getting health spending right.
Is health spending rising just inevitable because of an aging population?
I think it is inevitable. I think it's not just because of an aging population. I think there are all sorts of things going on with health spending. It rises in part because it's the one area of the economy where technology makes things more expensive, because you get a technology to make someone better, then they come back and get ill later. So, it's actually more expensive. Rather, if everyone sort of, pop their clogs nice and quickly at 65, it'd be a lot cheaper. But actually, we keep keeping them alive.
That's a hard policy to sell, Paul, of all of the ones.
It wasn't a policy proposal, but it was an example of why health is different. It also, if productivity doesn't rise like it does in the rest of the economy, then it becomes a bigger part of the economy. And actually, as we get richer, we want more of it. I mean, there's no point being rich if you're sick or dead. So it's not unreasonable to want to spend more on health. And, we are not in any sense unique in this. All countries have seen health spending rise over time as a fraction of national income. And my guess is we will continue to see it rise over time as a fraction of national income. Now, there are choices about how much of that has to be in the public sector. Do we want more of that to happen privately, as it does in some countries? I mean, the US is obviously an outlier, and I'm not talking about the US, but I mean, a lot of countries have a little bit of co-payment, a little bit of insurance alongside essentially a publicly funded, free at the point of use system. So there are choices around that. But in the end, I think we will spend more on health.
I think people's experience of private dentistry will have put people off private healthcare.
Yes, but the clearly over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a boom in the number of people using private healthcare as a response to the long waiting lists and the problems in the NHS. So, these are still relatively small sums of money in total, but people do shift their behaviour in response to the quality of what's available in the public sector.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which offers 1.5% cash back on all transactions until November the 1st, 2024. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN, R-A-M-I-N, or the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Other fees may apply. Interest applies on the uninvested cash in your account. Free shares can be fractional. Terms apply.
Just to zoom out onto the kind of macro perspective of the UK, and I guess you could say we've stagnated a bit as an economy since the financial crisis. And inevitably, how can we fix this? That's the question. Is it all about productivity growth? Is that what we need? Because that delivers higher wages, higher profits, and then you get the money through taxation to fund better public services.
Yes, though that doesn't really help, as it were, because the two things effectively mean the same thing. So yes, we do need productivity growth. It's the how you get there that's the issue. And at a high level, and I say this in my book, there is this kind of dirty secret, really, in the Treasury and Wire, which we kind of know, but we decide not to do it. And we decide not to do it because we decide it's too difficult to do politically or electorally, because it means planning reform, which means building houses in some people's back gardens and pylons in their front gardens, or roads, or what have you. And that's probably the most important thing, is actually really, really, really sorting out our capacity to build things.
I live in Amersham, so I know all about that. So you quoted Amersham in the book as one of the by-elections where...
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we have the absurdity of HS2 and the kind of catastrophe that has been. We have a tax system which we all know is not fit for purpose, but reforming it will make some people worse off, so we decide not to. Whatever your politics on Brexit, it's clear that that's bad for the economy. Again, we made the trade-off, as it were, for the political sovereignty instead of the growth or the productivity. We know that investing more in further and vocational education will be helpful, but we choose to cut it. And we know that well-focused infrastructure investment will be helpful, but actually in the books at the moment, it's going to be cut. So we continue to make choices and trade-offs which are on the wrong side if what we really want is growth and productivity, which is why actually, and I don't often say this about politicians, I thought at least some of the message from Keir Starmer at the Labour Party conference was quite positive, because he was talking about difficult trade-offs. He was basically saying, if you want growth, then some people have to have electricity pylons in their back gardens or close by. Well, that's true, and that's something that we need. If we are going to get better off, we're going to have to actually get grown up about some of these trade-offs. Now, because he didn't mention a lot of the other trade-offs, he didn't mention the trade-offs on tax, and he didn't mention the trade-offs on trade and all of those kinds of things, but at least he was talking about some trade-offs and not a sort of have your cake and eat it type things.
So do you think if we did want to plan something like a green transition that we could afford it, given the current constraints we've got on debt to GDP and the annual constraint that Labour's now imposed on itself?
Well, I think the green transition is a really interesting one, in the sense that one of the things that worries me about the Labour rhetoric is this insistence that green transition and growth are the same thing. They're not. They're both desirable, but they're not the same thing. You can have more of one and less of the other. Maximising growth would involve a different set of policies to maximising green transition. I think we need to be very clear about that, otherwise we're in danger of screwing up both. That's the first thing I'd say. Second thing is that a lot of the costs of green transition have been and will be held by the private sector. So, the costs of developing electric cars have been borne by essentially the car makers. The costs of moving to green electricity have essentially been borne by consumers. And these are some of the big things. The next big thing will be moving away from gas central heating. Now, that's going to have to involve some significant public investment, but not vast amounts in the context of whatever it is, £1.2 trillion a year that we spend. And we're talking maybe in the order of 20 billion a year. Oddly enough, the biggest cost might be losing the tax revenue from taxing petrol and diesel. Now, there are obvious alternatives to that. charging people for miles driven if they're an electric car or something. So that is choice. So I don't think the fiscal cost of the green transition is unmanageable, but of course it's a choice.
It seems like the government wants a lot more money to spend than it has. So do you think they might look to direct some of the pension savings in the UK more directly into the UK economy? Because at the moment you can, diversify around the world, as we would say is sensible from a personal point of view, from an investment point of view. But for the UK economy, you'd rather it going into UK growth companies, I imagine.
Yeah, lots of people talk about this, and it worries me a little bit. I mean, I think there's two. I think it's two elements to the pension story. One, of course, is the remaining defined benefit schemes, which are in the private sector mostly in sort of maturity and into rundown, which are hugely invested in gilts and not in the stock market at all. Now, that strikes me as being pretty bonkers, frankly. These are long-lasting organizations which can manage risk over generations, and they are in the safest, lowest return things they can find. Everyone would be better off if they were more vested in equities as they were 30 years ago, but that ship has probably sailed. But in terms of the defined contribution schemes that most of us are in, again, I think we need to be careful about mixing up objectives. I think, the objective of those things ought to be to invest in the best possible things for the people whose money it is that they're investing. And I get quite nervous if government started directing that into its own favourite British companies. I mean, I'd rather have someone who was actually investing this stuff where they thought it was going to get the biggest return for my retirement.
You're preaching to the converted there, Paul. No worries.
Yeah, definitely.
It's one of the questions we get asked more than anything, though, is, is this going to happen? Am I going to lose control of my pension effectively?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
But I think one of the things that people have talked about is, say, for example, removing the 25% tax-free lump sum. And you just think, well, one of the benefits, the only benefit really of putting money into a SIPP, say, is the interest rate differential between the time at which you withdraw the money and the time when you're paying in. So, I mean, would it be a good idea to do that, given that it could actually reduce the amount of money that people put into their SIPPs, into their pensions?
Well, it depends what you're trying to achieve with tax relief on pensions, really. I mean, in my view, the neutral system, and therefore, I think the place to start would be one where you put money in free of income tax, which broadly speaking is what we do at the moment, and then pay income tax on the way out. So how do things differ from that at the moment? Well, in quite a lot of big ways. One, actually, as I say, is the national insurance benefit if you're an employee and your employer is putting the money in, which is actually the large majority of contributions into pensions come from employers for that reason, because there's a national insurance benefit to that. So that's quite a big additional benefit to the income tax thing. Second, as you say, is the tax-free lump sum, where it does seem to be surprising that we allow people up to £250,000 tax-free, having put money in free of income tax. That seems like quite a big benefit. Now, you need to be very careful about making changes because you don't want to be too retrospective. So do you want to say no one can take out a tax-free lump sum at all from tomorrow? I think that would be pretty harsh. Particularly since some people will be expecting to use that to pay off mortgages and debts and all those sorts of things. So you'd have to do that quite gradually. It doesn't get you much money for quite a while. But I think there's certainly a case for reducing the generosity over time. And then the third, and I think most absurd part of it, is if you die before a particular age, you can leave the whole thing free of income tax and free of inheritance tax, which strikes me as being completely indefensible.
It's one of these things, when you first hear the policy, you just think that can't be true. But then it is true.
And free of capital gains tax, right?
It's completely mad.
And then resetting the capital gains when someone dies. So let's say that I inherited stock from my mum, then the actual capital gains that I pay will be based on the value of the stock when she died. Mm-hmm. So it kind of resets, and it incentivizes you, as you say in the book, to hold these investments until you die.
Yeah, and that's incredibly economically inefficient, and also sort of unjust. So the forgiving capital gains at death results in lots of people holding on to capital gains way beyond the point at which it's good for them, because they might actually want to unlock the money, therefore way beyond the point where it's good for the economy, and creates just inequity between similar people. So, I mean, that's something that needs to be changed.
Is there a similar danger involved in literally raising the rate of capital gains tax? You hear a lot about should it be equalized with income tax, but if you're invested in one stock, it's gone up a lot, then you're thinking, oh, there's this another company. I could sell that and invest it in this growth company. Oh, but I can't because I'm going to pay, let's say 40% if it goes up to that on the sale. I'm giving that up immediately. That's a
Yeah.
huge barrier to switch investments.
Yeah, there's a big lock-in problem with capital gains tax for exactly that reason, that it's very expensive. It's a bit like stamp duty. I mean, the more often you trade, the more tax you end up paying. And again, that's inefficient. So reform of capital gains tax is a really complicated thing to get right. It is definitely not just about increasing the rate to equalise with income tax. At the very least, you need to give allowances for inflation and actually for a normal rate of return, so that you are not disincentivizing saving and investment. And this is what slightly worries me about some of the stories coming out about capital gains tax changing in this budget. Has the government really had time to think really properly about doing it in a way which is sustainable over time? Because capital gains tax has been messed around with time and time and time again. And the history of early changes in governments is that they've had to come back and unpick the mess they've made later on.
We talk to a lot of investors in our community, and you'll be surprised how many are selling assets to lock in capital gains tax at the lower rate in the belief that it may go up in the budget. So it is like changing behavior already, even the rumor of it.
No, I'm not surprised. I mean, everyone I've talked to in this world has told me exactly the same thing, and I mean, presumably we'll be able to see this in the tax figures next year, where we'll see a spike up in receipts from capital gains tax, and presumably a spike down next year. And that's one of the problems about making policy in this area. When people are expecting change, that's going to affect their behaviour, and this is an area where changing your behaviour in terms of timing is relatively straightforward.
So coming back to this productivity puzzle and why we really haven't had much growth in the UK for nigh on 2 decades, do you think part of the problem is that so much of our wealth is tied up in property? I looked through some ONS data recently, and about half of UK wealth is in property. But it isn't a productive use of capital, really. If you want to put it into new companies, clearly that would be more productive. So is that part of the problem?
I'm not sure that's quite the right. I mean, we don't have enough property in the UK. It's not that we've got too much property. And obviously, the amount of property that there is will determine the level of wealth. What you're seeing is that the value of property is high, in part because there isn't enough of it, and in part because of what's been happening to interest rates and so on. So I'm not sure that's the right way of posing the question.
I think from my point of view, it's the problem that if you're a young person, you have to save a large amount of money for a deposit, which could be used to start a business or invest or whatever. So the cost of housing relative to wages is too high.
Yeah. So the cost of housing is a problem. I don't think so the problem is not that there is too much wealth in housing. The problem is that is concentrated in too few houses. So if we had the same amount of wealth in housing but a lot more houses, then that would be a less investment per person who is trying to buy a house, and therefore more capacity to save in pensions and so on. So in the long run, I do think the answer is we need an awful lot more houses, especially in London and the South East.
And what's your sense about, realistically, do you think Britain can get back to that sort of strong GDP growth rate that we saw pre-financial crisis, like 2.5% or above? Could we get there, or is that just pie in the sky now?
Well, we probably will one day, but probably take us by surprise when it happens. Can we? I don't know. And over the next few years, I think we'll be lucky to manage 2%, maybe 1.5%. But actually, we might get lucky. I think we understate the extent to which the financial crisis, which now feels like a long time ago, has had a long shadow. And it's had a long shadow across all developed economies, but it's had a longer shadow over the UK, partly through a bigger financial sector. And we've also clearly had the shocks of Brexit, COVID, political chaos, energy price hikes, and so on. So it's been a pretty rocky decade and a half. If we get a less rocky decade and a half going forward, then things might start to move in the right direction. We know that technological change should be helping and so on. Demographic change is against us, although, to some extent we're pushing against that with very high levels of inward migration. So that there are lots of moving parts here. I'm not completely pessimistic about the future. And what I think the last 10, 15 years tells you is what we experienced recently is not necessarily what happens forever. I don't think, no one expected zero interest rates for a decade, but once they've been there for a decade, everyone seemed to expect them forever. And then, clearly that's not what's happened. And no one expected inflation to spike up at 10%. Things change. And maybe because of good policy, maybe because of what's happening in the rest of the world, maybe because of pure luck, growth may change. That's not a very economicsy kind of answer. I think it is a sort of, just because things have been crap for 15 years doesn't mean they're always going to be crap.
It's the truth, though, isn't it?
One of the things in your book, which I thought was great, was a comment about solutions are often reactions to headlines, and Whitehall's natural solution is to centralize control. And I was wondering if part of the problem isn't that there isn't any way of funding things in a devolved way. So, for example, in the United States, they have a municipal bond system where if you buy a municipal bond which is local, you don't pay tax on it. So that's the essential innovation which allowed the municipal bond market to really take off in the US. So you can kind of feel good about buying one of these local bonds. It funds libraries, schools locally. But there's no way for local governments in the UK to fund themselves other than through the council tax system. Do you think something like a municipal bond system would kind of break this linkage between centralization and decentralization?
I think the real thing that will break that linkage is actually more about devolving powers over decision making on health and education and so on. I mean, at the moment, all of those budgets just come down in a silo from Whitehall with very little say at local level. I mean, an alternative way of doing it would be, rather as we do with Scotland or Northern Ireland or what have you, here's the money, now you've got a lot of choice about how you spend that. Now, we don't even have that level of devolution to big city regions or big areas in England. So it seems to me that will be the place that I would start in terms of devolution. And then, of course, you have to think very hard about what the consequences of devolving, borrowing or tax-raising powers would be. It would clearly be very disequalizing. So, if you did this, London and Surrey and so on would have piles of money to spend. So you'd have, and Merseyside wouldn't. And then you'd have to think very hard about, well, then you need to do a whole load of redistribution. Now, in England, we have always focused a lot on that redistribution, at least until recently. I mean, we've stopped that to some extent recently. Again, there are trade-offs. To what extent do you want to, as it were, if you give tax or borrowing raising powers independently of redistribution to different parts of the country, then actually you probably create more inequality, not less.
Okay, a final question. If you were put in charge and given free rein with no political constraints here, you don't have to worry about the electorate. It's a benevolent dictatorship, I hope.
Excellent. Love it.
What is the one big change you would do in terms of tax and spending policy?
If I had one tax thing I could do, I would abolish stamp duty. I would do that very quickly. And I think of all of the taxes, and against serious competition, it is the worst and the most destructive of all. And if you wanted me to pay for it, I would do that. Well, essentially any tax rise would be better, but I would reform council tax so that higher value properties were paying more than they are now. And if that wasn't getting me enough, then I'd probably just put a penny on income tax or something to pay for it. So if it was one tax policy, get rid of stamp duty.
I was going to say you'd be really popular until you started the second half of that about how you're going to pay for it.
Well, that's always the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I hope you're enjoying our interview with Paul Johnson. In fact, one of our members suggested we interview him after reading Paul's book, Follow the Money. If you want to say in what we do, why not join our community at pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, we'll have a quick fire tax policy round. So, Paul, all you have to do is say, how likely are these policies to be introduced in your view in the foreseeable future, and would they be good?
Okay.
So 1, equalised capital gains tax and income tax rates. Kind of already answered that.
I think fairly likely. but only good if the capital gains tax base is also reformed. If it's not, then probably bad.
Abolish higher rate tax relief on pension contributions.
I'd say that's 50-50, partly because it's very complicated and would hit a lot of public sector workers. I do not think it would be a good idea.
Abolish the tax-free lump sum on pensions.
I think done over a long period of time, effectively by taking it down very gradually, would be a good thing. I think there's a reasonable chance of that, but doesn't get you much money for a long time. So that probably reduces the probability. Doing it overnight, I think, has got some serious downsides.
End the inheritance tax pension loophole.
I think that's quite likely and clearly good.
End the triple lock.
It will end eventually.
It has to, right?
Yeah. I think some version of ending it within the next decade is more likely than not. And it needs to be ended in some sense. I think what we need is to know what level of state pension we want to end up with, and we want the parties to agree that it is, say, a third of average earnings or whatever, then aim for that and then stick there.
Which leads us to means test the state pension.
I think it's unlikely, and I think it'd be a very bad idea.
Cap ISAs.
I don't. It might be likely because we know that Torsten Bell, who was head of the Resolution Foundation, is now a Labour MP, has been in favour. I think it'd be a bad idea. I can't see any good reason for doing it.
Merge income tax and national insurance.
Easy to say and very good in principle. It's not going to happen. It's far too complicated.
And just two more. Reform the council tax bands.
Clearly should happen. To a little extent, it is happening in Wales. I mean, the Welsh are making some reforms, so it's not impossible. Not this Parliament, but it clearly needs to happen.
Last one.
Introduce a wealth tax.
I think it's unlikely, and I think it's a very bad idea. I think we've got a bunch of taxes on wealth at the moment which work badly. Let's try and fix those. And I don't know of any effective wealth tax anywhere in the world.
Brilliant. That was so helpful. And let me just say, there are certain institutions, and I just think about them, and I think I'm so grateful they exist. And one of them is the IFS. It's just outstanding in terms of the research you produce. And it's so objective. And almost any question about the UK economy, you've written a white paper about it.
Excellent.
It's been brilliant having you on, and we both loved your book, Follow the Money. And please keep educating us as a population. We need it. I sometimes feel that the politicians make the wrong choices because we don't know what they should be doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Do send us your questions, no matter how dumb, at the email address mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a Pensioncraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.